Good evening. Welcome to day 47 of our quarantine here in the 47th video. I am joined, as always, by Presidents George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and I'm here tonight with another presidential story. We did some JFK assassination stuff the last couple of days, so I'll sort of stick in that same theme, and we're going to talk about the assassination of President James Garfield today. Probably a president most of you do not know much about. That's mostly because he was not president for very long. James Garfield was only president for about 4 months when he was assassinated. He was shot on July 2nd, 1881, effectively ending his presidency. He would not die for 79 days, but essentially he was unable to make any more decisions after that. He was bedridden and for a lot of that time really very sick. Sort of in and out of being looking like he might make it to looking like he was going to die for long periods of time there. So let's back it up a little bit here. So James Garfield was from Ohio. He had served in the Civil War. He had gained the rank of brigadier general during the Civil War when he was in his 30s. During the middle of the Civil War, he actually was elected to Congress in Ohio for the first time, where he served 9 terms in the House of Representatives. So he spent a long time in the House of Representatives, all the way from 1862 until 1881 when he was elected president. So he is elected president in 1881. There had been basically a series of sort of scandalous, corruption-ridden presidencies. The presidents themselves weren't always necessarily scandalous, but people around them. For instance, Ulysses S. Grant, most people believed was pretty straightforward guy, but he was too trusting of his friends who were basically robbing and bilking the treasury and all kinds of things around him. So there was a lot of that in the post-Civil War years, but Garfield was known to be incorruptible, essentially, somebody who was going to bring back some prestige to the office of the presidency. Kind of get things cleaned up a little bit. One of the big things that Garfield wanted to attack was the patronage system. This idea that you give all of your friends jobs in the government when you get elected, which was happening not just at the presidential level, but at all levels of government, basically through the Senate, through the House of Representatives, state governments, you name it. But he wanted to eliminate that in the federal government, where basically that he wanted to appoint qualified people, not just people who had helped him or his friends or cronies. So that was one of his goals as he was getting in. Again, he didn't have much time to get much going. Only 4 months in, he is set to leave Washington on July 2nd. In those days, before air conditioning, Washington, D.C., it just gets oppressively hot in the summer, and a lot of kind of diseases and things would come up. Washington, D.C. is built on what was originally a swamp, and so things like malaria and other types of things like that would become pretty prevalent. And so people that could afford to would usually leave Washington, D.C. during the summer when it started to get really hot. So he's on his way out. He's going to a train station in Washington, D.C. He's there to, he's going to give a speech before he leaves. And interestingly enough, one of the people that was there is Robert Todd Lincoln, who was actually the Secretary of War for James Garfield, who Robert Todd Lincoln happens to be Abraham Lincoln's son. And he is there at the train station to see the president off after his speech. Unfortunately, he is unable to make his train as a man, Charles Guiteau, comes up behind Garfield, shoots once, kind of grazes Garfield's shoulder. Garfield screams something to the effect of, "Well, what has happened to me?" And then Guiteau shoots again, this time hitting him in the back. Does just miss the spinal cord, but the bullet is lodged in Garfield's body. It does not exit, and it's in his body. And Garfield goes down. Guiteau turns to leave. He actually had a hansom cab, which is a horse-drawn cab, waiting for him. He turns to leave to go to his cab, but a police officer actually was rushing in, having heard the gunshots, grabs this man who's leaving the scene, realizes it's the shooter, and so Guiteau is arrested. And so 79 days, James Garfield is essentially fighting for his life for 79 days. We realize today that probably in the end, in modern day, he would have survived the wound. The wound was probably not fatal as it was. I mean, he did make it 79 days, so he almost certainly would have lived in modern day with modern medicine. But it was just at the beginning of the time when doctors were starting to understand bacteria, and there were only some doctors believed in this idea of bacteria. Other doctors thought it was hogwash, essentially. And unfortunately for Garfield, his doctor, the presidential doctor, was not a believer in bacteria. Did not believe it was true. And so this bullet that was lodged inside of Garfield, he tried over and over to remove with his bare hands, which were dirty and bacteria ridden. And so what ends up happening is Garfield gets multiple different infections that end up is what he really ends up dying from. It's from the doctor who continually probed his bare hands into the president's wound, trying to find the bullet, which they never were able to get out, and every time with his dirty bacteria-ridden hands in there. And so 79 days later, sadly, James Garfield presidency that really did hold a lot of promise, and one that we may know a lot more about today had it lasted longer than 4 months, because again, like I said, Garfield was considered to be a pretty stand-up guy and somebody who might have made some positive change. He dies 79 days in. His assassin, Charles Guiteau, was a sort of mentally unstable person. His reason for shooting the president was that he believed he had the president owed him a job in some manner or another. That he had passed out some pamphlets, he said, for Garfield, which of course Garfield would have never even known about. And he had come to Garfield to ask him for a job, and Garfield had said no. And so, yeah, he said that was the reason. It was retaliation. He felt that Garfield had owed him a job, and so it was retaliation for not getting this job. Like I said, he was fairly mentally unstable. He was convinced that the vice president, Chester Arthur, who Arthur and Garfield were not exactly close, he thought that Arthur was going to reward him. Guiteau thought Arthur would reward him with a job. He was sitting in prison, and when he heard that Garfield had died 79 days in, he believed that Chester Arthur would be there within the hour to congratulate him, to thank him, and to give him some sort of job within the government. Of course, that did not happen. And even though he continued to believe that he was some sort of hero, that the country would see him as a hero, right up until he was being walked to the gallows. But none of that ever happened. He meets the same fate as Garfield, though many days later. But he is executed as well. The big effect of all of this, lasting effect, is that because as I said earlier, Garfield was hoping to kind of reform the system, what was called the spoil system, which people were getting jobs with no qualifications. Because of his assassination, it was pretty crucial using that. His successor, Chester Arthur, used that as a reason basically to pass the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And the Pendleton Civil Service Act says that you must have qualifications to have the government non-elected positions, and led to civil service tests, which we still have today. You still have to prove qualifications. There are still civil service tests, whether you're going to work for the United States Postal Service or anywhere as a non-elected government official. You have to prove that you have knowledge in those areas and abilities. And before that, it did not happen. So Garfield's death did lead to some positive change, some change that he was hoping to make. So in the very least, there was that in death, one of his goals did get accomplished, in his death being sort of a major catalyst for accomplishing that goal. So anyways, there is the story of James Garfield's assassination, his crazy assassin, and the impact that it had going forward, and still impacting us today with the Pendleton Civil Service Act. But anyway, I hope everybody's having a great day and enjoyed some time outside. It was a beautiful day. Looks like tomorrow will be another beautiful day, and we'll talk to you soon. See you then. Bye.